funny sort of a way, you know, I feel closer to rats than I do to people. You know, I mean, even though I kill them for a living, you see, their dying is my living, you might say.
I've always been drawn to the idea of banned films and the notorious niches of not-to-be-trifled-with cinema. And it's not because I'm a glutton for thoughtless obscenity or the pointlessly grotesque. I just don't much care for the idea of people I've never met making arbitrary but all-encompassing decisions about what is and isn't suitable for mass consumption. The right to artistic expression is sacrosanct. We should be discussing the disgusting, debating the debased, not trying to sweep them under some subjective rug of morality.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Of these taboo-challenging films, few are spoken of with the hushed reverence and revolted retrospection of Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. A dramatic helter-skelter that became one of the most censored works of the 1970s, saw two cinematographers quit on religious and ethical grounds, and was banned in the UK by the BBFC until 2002. 50 years on from its release, I'm going to try and sift through some of the shattered glass of this tough, transgressive work.
Why don't you just go make some coffee?
Our plot centres on English expat Amy Sumner returning to the Cornish countryside of her youth, alongside her all-too-American husband, David. Not long after their arrival, tensions between the Sumners and this conservative community start to dissolve their marital bliss, culminating in two of the most infamous scenes to ever stain the pop cultural landscape. Given the era it was released into, it's impossible to separate this film's fish-out-of-water anxieties and reflexive barbarism from the context of the then ongoing Vietnam War. In 1971, the sight of ordinary Americans killing their fellow man amongst the greenery of a foreign land under the guise of defending the homestead was a staple of the nightly news. Straw Dogs just dressed these ideological confrontations in trousers and tweed, stoking the fires of distrust between smooth-palmed intellectualism and blue-collar subsistence. As far as the Sumners are concerned, their new neighbours are work-shy regressive Neanderthals. To these close-knit agrarian folk, the atheistic, sexually liberated Americanization the Sumners represent stands as a clear and present threat of cultural erasure.
What I am.
Thematically, narratively, philosophically, there's a cutthroat conflict to every bated breath. Straw Dogs is modernity versus traditionalism, the reactionary versus rationality, masculinity versus femininity. Yet, director Sam Peckinpah never seems interested in choosing one side over the other. This is more a goading provocation than a cautionary tale, a study of sex, civility, and primal violence, presented with an almost inhuman detachment.
What was that about?
Throughout much of Peckinpah's filmography, there's a disconcerting emphasis on the savage acts of man. Cross of Iron throws waves of mutilation at the lens until glorification turns to disgust. The Wild Bunch finds pressure points in the space between honour and betrayal. Think of Peckinpah's violence as a statement against violence theatrics, as a more muddled prototype of what Michael Haneke would master a few decades later. Straw Dogs draws its cruelty along territorial lines of amplified masculinity, the childish notion that displays of machismo and aggression are the quickest shortcut to personal satisfaction. These muscular posturings, as seen in the quick-to-anger outbursts of bitter drunks and an extremely phallic round of woodland shooting, reek of desperation, even if their aftermath is pulverizing and permanent. Peckinpah routinely falls back on his belief that men contain an inherently animalistic darkness.
I have a grant to study possible structures in stellar interiors and the implications regarding their radiation characteristics.
Radiation, that's an unfortunate dispensation.
Surely is.
As long as it's not another bomb. You're a scientist. Can you deny the responsibility?
Can you? After all, there's never been a kingdom given to so much bloodshed as that of Christ.
Over the course of the film, we watch David retreat into this primal state, leaving behind the complex reasoning of academia and callousing over his humanity.
Stay there and do as you're told. If you don't, I'll break your neck.
Straw Dogs is a harrowing document of fragile male egos and vile overcompensation, cut loose without guilt or so much as a backwards glance to the horrors they leave behind.
I don't know my way home.
It's okay. I don't either.
If the masculine contingent of this once sleepy hamlet represents the war raging in the mind of man, then what of the supposed fairer sex? It's here, in its depiction of women and female autonomy, where Straw Dog's most troubling implications show their teeth.
Take your hands off me.
From the first gratuitous shot of Amy's braless chest, to the film's most infamous sequence, it's impossible not to ask, is all of this about misogyny, or is it just misogynistic? Well, in the most frustrating of contradictions, it's both. As an audience, we're shown two primary examples of femininity: the headstrong complexities of Amy, and the uncomfortable Lolita affectations of Janice. Amy is immediately established as a force of progressive sexuality in a regressive environment. A personification of the second-wave feminist movement, Amy stands out against a backdrop of unchanging patriarchal stubbornness. Her refusal to slide into the demure, seen but not heard housewife role is an act of resistance, whether or not it's intended to be. Janice, the young girl this village tries in vain to shelter from women's liberation and sexual awakening, is first introduced alongside Amy and dressed in a remarkably similar manner. With these points of comparison, Peckinpah is doing two things. He's letting us know that the antiquated values this village strives to uphold have already started to fail, whilst highlighting the flagrant hypocrisy of a group of men leering with judgmental arousal at one woman who is essentially dressed the same as their pure and precious ward. Whether they're defiled by it or protected from it, lustful carnality is used to define these women. It's a blood-curdling montage of objectification, and it's this monstrous mentality that leads to one of cinema's most controversial sequences: the rape of Amy. While I won't be showing any footage from this because I can't and I don't want to, just know that it's going to be discussed, and you should feel free to skip to this time code if you'd rather avoid it. While David is off proving his masculine worth to the locals, he leaves Amy home alone. Charlie, Amy's scorned ex, enters their house under false pretenses before assaulting and raping Amy. After every form of resistance has failed to stop Charlie, Amy tries to engage him somewhat tenderly in an attempt to mitigate his aggression, after which Charlie's friend Scott shows up and rapes Amy again. Later that evening, when David returns home, a visibly distressed Amy mentions nothing of these events to her husband. It's a repugnant curb stomp of a sequence, one that the term problematic was practically invented for. First, let's look at the much parroted notion that has made this scene so infamous. The idea that mid-rape, Amy decides that she's either enjoying or consenting to Charlie's attack because she stops actively resisting it. To be frank, that viewpoint is total trash, and those who band it around like it's some subversive twist on cinematic depictions of sexual assault can just fuck all the way off. Amy does not, nor can she possibly be said to consent to an act that occurs after Charlie has entered her home under false pretenses, struck her, and forced himself on her with physical, verbal, and emotional violence, as she repeatedly states no again and again. What happens here is not sex. It's an act of possessive, domineering, penetrative violence. It's also worth remembering, Straw Dogs is in no way a rape revenge film. As Elena Lazik writes in her terrific piece over at Little White Lies, the attack is not what eventually triggers David into finally revolting against these local men. Amy's suffering is not the fuel that advances David's story. The importance of this scene to the larger thematic marrow of masculine entitlement isn't the issue. What is, comes down to just how little the gratuitous, protracted staging of this moment pays off narratively or developmentally for Amy. A woman who begins this feature as a firebrand of progressive, patriarchy-skewering ideals, concludes it shivering and distraught, surrounded by the trophies of her husband's territorialist rampage. As I said earlier, whether this is a comment on misogyny or just outright misogynistic is never clear. Given the gravity and severity of what happens to Amy, I'm inclined to consider that a failure rather than intentional ambiguity.
You're a coward.
Oh, no.
And I'm a coward. Plain and simple.
Joshua Clover, writing for the Criterion Collection back in 2002, defends Straw Dogs from the accusation that it fails its female characters, offering the rebuttal that, to name the movie misogynistic is to mistake the degree to which it is a movie that despises everyone. Now, for Clover's stance to make sense would require an equality to the misery that's doled out, and that simply isn't the case.
Fix the toilet and clean up the kitchen. That would be a terrific help.
The men of Straw Dogs destroy one another and themselves through their own faults of hubris and phallocentric ego. If anyone here could claim the faintest hint of catharsis, which is certainly a debatable point, it would be David. Now compare that to the outcomes for the two women we're given any real chance to engage with. One is physically and psychologically ravaged by sour misogyny, and the other is outright killed by it. A fatal flaw that caused Pauline Kael to dub Straw Dogs the first American film that is a fascist work of art.
I will not allow violence against this house.
In the 50 years since its release, there have been torrents of trash that use similarly vile acts for unforgivably crass, exploitative titillation with no academic worth. Conversely, there have been efforts to address the failings of Straw Dogs that respect and empathise with their female characters beyond the shallow genre conventions of victimisation and reclamation. You'd think there'd be no better chance to recontextualise and reevaluate what Straw Dogs means than with its shiny 2011 remake. So, what changed when Sony Pictures dragged this material into the new millennium? Almost nothing? Not since the US remake of Funny Games have I seen such a beat-by-beat attempt to simply teleport an existing work to a new geographical location. What minor changes it does make initially seem negligible. Cornwall, England is now the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and David's profession has switched from mathematician to screenwriter. These differences are only ever used superficially, which is a wasted opportunity and a testament to this remake's inherent redundancy. With the rest largely being a shot-for-shot recreation, missing the opportunity to address any of the criticisms of the 1971 original, opting instead just to make everything and everyone look much prettier. Oh, and for anyone who doesn't know why the film is called Straw Dogs, at one point the remake just hits the pause button so David can explain the metaphor for anyone in the cheap seats.
Bunch of straw dogs.
Straw dogs?
Yeah, in ancient Chinese rituals, dogs made of straw were used as offerings to the gods. During the ritual, they were treated with the utmost reverence. When they were no longer needed, they were tossed aside, trampled on. They became nothing.
Thanks for that, Cyclops, you handsome bastard. For all its meticulous craft, excellent performances, and disgusting moral implications, what's the legacy of 1971's Straw Dogs? Much like its director, both present sustained notes of ferocious intelligence and envelope-pushing provocation that would alter the landscape of cinema for decades to come, whilst tarnishing its own insightfulness with boorish vulgarity and half-baked beliefs that wilt under the faintest of scrutiny.
I think I would have to say that I have a conflicted response to this film. I think the film deserves its controversial status. I don't think that we should whitewash it and say, oh, Peckinpah's a great artist. He is a great artist, but, you know, there are great artists who, in their artistry, conveyed bad, evil, misogynist, fascist messages. And this is an exemplary version of all of that.
Whether I think it's a problematic masterpiece to be cautiously acclaimed, or a needlessly nihilistic wound that seeps with ideas it can't quite articulate, tends to change from one day to the next. And that's what's so powerful about this film. The fact we're half a century removed from its release, and folks like me still aren't sure where we stand. That's the legacy of Straw Dogs. A reprehensible masterpiece, and a culturally significant septic tank we'll no doubt be reckoning with for decades to come. Shout out to our Patreon producers Jennifer C, Claire MD, Becky O, and Nicholas Lair Revere, and an enormous thanks to all these folks over on Patreon who help support the channel. Are you aware of the reputation of Straw Dogs? And if so, what are your thoughts on it? If you've seen the original, the remake, or both, I'd love to hear your take on it in the comments down below. As you can probably tell from the video, the critical consensus is incredibly mixed, and my thoughts are no different. If you'd like to help this channel, like and comment on these videos for engagement, and share them on social media, Reddit, or wherever you do that sort of thing. And if you're in a position to do so, consider checking out our Patreon at the link in the description below, where you can get your name in the credits, access to our private Discord, and a membership to the In Frame Out Film Club. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, this is In Frame Out.